"You don't belong anywhere near this tech, janitor." The words sliced through the air like a dull blade, followed by the sharp crack of a prototype case being slammed shut. A young white executive in a crisp navy suit sneered as he kicked the equipment box across the polished floor, sending a tangle of cables and circuit boards skidding to Elliot's feet. Behind him, a few engineers stifled laughs. Elliot didn't flinch. He just stood there, mop in hand, as the metallic clang echoed through the sterile hallway. No retaliation, no explanation, just a silence thick with judgment. The executive's voice dropped low, smug. "Whatever dream you had, let go. You're here to clean up after the real engineers." No one noticed the way Elliot's eyes flicked, not in anger, but calculation. He said nothing, because the man he just humiliated was the founder of the entire company. The hallway still hung with fluorescent light and a faint trace of laughter echoing from a lab, but Elliot didn't glance back. He moved quietly, pushing his cleaning cart past the glass panels etched with the company's sleek name. No Vitek Systems. From the outside, he was just another maintenance contractor. Plain gray coveralls, ID badge labeled E, Garner, head slightly bowed, hands always busy. No one ever looked twice. And that was the point. 3 weeks ago, he'd walked into this building not as a founder, not as an inventor, but as a ghost. He'd signed his own clearance papers using an old alias from college, filed under a third-party janitorial firm he personally owned through a shell corporation. No red carpet, no corner office, just surveillance reports tucked inside his locker and 2 fingers always on the company's pulse. He hadn't come to clean floors. He'd come to see what had rotted beneath them. It hadn't always been like this. 10 years ago, Elliot Grant had stood on a TEDx stage in a worn blazer and jeans, demoing a wireless chip the size of a dime that could map internal system failure in real time. Back then, he was the wonder kid from East Ridge who graduated top of his class at Carnegie Mellon, the son of a postal clerk and a science teacher, raised on duct tape, public libraries, and weekend robotics fairs. He'd built the foundation for no Vitek from cramped garage with a dented microwave, 2 white bards, and a broken fan. Investors called him a genius. Reporters wanted sound bites. But as soon as the patent started attracting defense contractors, the temperature shifted. One offer came with NDAs, another with equity dilution. Then came the one that nearly broke him. $50 million to walk away, in full, with zero trace left behind. A buyout designed to erase him. Now, from behind a mop and a worn pair of latex gloves, Elliot watched the system he had once designed run without a single mention of his name. The labs were shinier now, the furniture more ergonomic, the engineers younger and louder. He knew most of their credentials by heart. Top hires from Stanford, MIT, even a Rhodes Scholar in optics. And yet their arrogance pulsed louder than their innovation. One of them, Cameron Dresner, strutted like he owned the patents. He didn't. Elliot had seen his test results, skimmed his lines of code, left open on a monitor, all shallow mimicry of architecture he himself had written half a decade ago. No one suspected the janitor, humming 80s soul in the hallway, could recite every function of their firmware blindfolded. That was the real test. Not the code, not the labs, but whether any of them could even recognize brilliance when it wasn't wearing a badge of power. Elliot hadn't returned out of nostalgia. He came back because something fell off. 6 months ago, during an anonymous audit request, he'd noticed slight discrepancies in the diagnostic logs, data that didn't match what his original architecture would allow. Someone had altered the system, not to improve it, but to make it more profitable, more aggressive in license expansion, less transparent in client data handling. It wasn't just bad code. It was manipulation, done quietly, buried beneath sleek quarterly reports and PowerPoint decks. He knew if he confronted them from a boardroom, they'd gaslight him with legal jargon and compliance checklists. But if he saw it unravel in real time, from the basement up, if he could document every crack in the wall they painted over, then he'd have something more powerful than accusations. He'd have proof. And for that, he needed to become invisible. even if it meant cleaning up their messes. That morning, as Elliot bent to pick up a discarded energy drink can outside Lab B, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the dark server glass. The same eyes, the same steady jawline, but aged with a decade of silence. He straightened slowly, adjusted the strap of his utility belt, and turned just as a burst of laughter erupted behind him. Cameron, again flanked by two junior techs, pointing toward the waistband like it was a stage prop. "You missed a spot," Cameron barked, smirking. Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he made a note on the small tablet hidden beneath a rag in his cart. Timestamp, location, behavior. Every moment mattered. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to watch, to listen, and when the time came, to pull the thread that would unravel everything they thought they'd built without him. For now, he would let them think he was nothing. That afternoon, Elliot was mopping near the glass wall that separated Lab B from the common workspace when the door hissed open and a flood of voices spilled out. Cameron, still riding the high of his latest pitch, clutched a tablet under his arm while spinning a coffee cup in one hand like a trophy. "We need to rethink the integration rate," he said, waving at a screen showing test diagnostics. "The latency issue isn't about power draw. It's signal lag from the micropulse array. Basic stuff." His tone carried the swagger of someone who thought they'd invented physics. Elliot continued sweeping, but the corner of his eye caught the diagnostic chart. The flaw wasn't the pulse array. It was in the thermal drift coefficient, a small parameter shift he'd embedded years ago as a self-calibrating failsafe. But no one in the room even knew it existed, because no one had ever asked who actually built the base code. One of the junior engineers, a lanky guy with nervous hands named Trevor, noticed Elliot lingering near the door. "Hey," he called out, voice dripping with amusement. "Careful not to trip on the genius zone. Sensitive equipment in here." The others chuckled, some uncomfortably, some eagerly. Elliot gave a quiet nod and resumed wiping the floor. But Trevor wasn't done. "Actually," he continued, grabbing a spare folder from the counter. "Mind filing this for us?" He held out the folder mockingly, just far enough to make Elliot walk around a cable rig to reach it. Elliot hesitated for half a breath, then stepped forward, but as he did, Trevor accidentally nudged the leg of a wheeled cart, sending a cluster of calibration tools tumbling down with a loud metallic clatter. Bits rolled under desks. A lens cracked on impact. The room went still, and just like that, all eyes turned to Elliot. Cameron stepped forward, jaw clenched like he was squashing a real threat. "Not a janitor. Are you serious?" he snapped, sweeping his hand toward the scatter tools. "You have any idea what these cost? This isn't your uncle's garage. This is a sealed lab, not a junkyard." He didn't wait for an answer. Security should really do a better job screening temps. One screw up like this, and we're weeks behind. Elliot knelt wordlessly, gathering the tools with deliberate care. He picked up the cracked lens last, turning it over slowly between his fingers. "This isn't standard lab glass," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. "It's a Markov 8 array, precision treated, but you're using it on an open-air rig." The room froze. Cameron blinked. Trevor frowned. But before anyone could speak, Elliot stood, placed the lens neatly on the counter, and returned to his mop. He didn't look back. In the back corner of the lab, a senior engineer named Daryl Hensley had stayed quiet through the chaos. He was older than most, with graying temples and a habit of scribbling notes on paper instead of tablets. As Elliot walked out of the room without a word, Daryl's brow furrowed. Something about the way the man handled the lens, the way he spoke, it didn't line up. "Markov 8, he muttered to himself. Not many people outside the core dev team even knew that spec, and fewer still could identify it by touch. Daryl watched as Elliot rounded the corner, then glanced at Cameron. "You ever seen that janitor before?" Cameron scoffed. "Probably rotated in last week. Doesn't matter. Just keep him out of our space." But Daryl didn't answer. His mind was already elsewhere, reaching back years. There had been a young man, quiet, brilliant black, who once drew schematics on napkins and rewired prototype boards in under an hour. Back in the equipment annex, Elliot wheeled his cart into the dimly lit diagnostics room. Far from the curated chaos of a lab, he closed the door behind him and, with practiced ease, removed the mop head to reveal a slimline tablet embedded beneath the handle. He powered it on, his fingers dancing over encrypted interfaces. The company's firmware logs were accessible through a backdoor he had coded years ago. A tiny slice of himself, still living inside the system no one thought to clean out. He began flagging irregular thermal patterns, indexing code commits that bore Cameron's signature, yet reused Elliot's original syntax with slight alterations. Lazy alterations. Dangerous ones. He wasn't angry. He was precise. Line by line, he traced how corners were being cut, how calibration protocols were bypassed for speed. It wasn't just ego running wild in that lab. It was negligence, and it was starting to metastasize across the company's most vital product. As he exited the diagnostics room, Elliot nearly collided with a young woman carrying a box of circuit boards. She stumbled slightly, and he caught the edge of the box before it tipped. "Thanks," she said, catching her breath. Didn't know custodial had access to this wing. Her tone was polite, but curious. Elliot offered a brief smile. "I get around," he replied, voice calm. She studied him a second longer than necessary, eyes flicking between his badge and his face. "You used to work on hardware?" she asked, gesturing at the schematic on the tablet still peeking from under his rack. Elliot paused. "Long time ago," he said, then pushed his car down the hall. The woman watched him go, her brow creased. Behind the veneer of institutional lights and recycled air, something had shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. For the first time in years, Elliot's presence was starting to register, and the questions had just begun. Daryl couldn't shake the feeling. All afternoon, he kept circling back to that voice, that precision. It wasn't just what Elliot said, it was how he said it. The deliberate cadence, the surgical detail, the way he cradled the broken lens like it was a living thing. Late that evening, long after most had gone home, Daryl opened an archive company directory from a decade earlier. He scrolled through the earliest team photos, grainy shots taken in the garage days before the office had walls, when half the wiring was held together by tape and stubbornness. And there, standing next to the first-gen prototype, was a younger Elliot. No name under the photo, just Core Team, 2014. Daryl zoomed in, leaned back, and whispered to himself, "I knew it." He closed the file slowly, a storm gathering behind his eyes. Someone was about to find out who they were really working for, and who they'd been mocking. The next morning, Elliot arrived earlier than usual. He bypassed the lower lab floors and took the service elevator straight to the executive wing. It was a calculated risk, the kind of move that didn't go unnoticed, but he wasn't hiding anymore. At least, not entirely. Outside the main boardroom, voices echoed through thick glass. Charts, projections, valuations. Words like acquisition leverage and liquidity event peppered the air like confetti. Elliot knew the language. He'd helped write the original shareholder agreements, and now they were twisting them into knots to justify what he suspected all along, a pending sale. He leaned against a maintenance cabinet and opened his tablet. A scheduled entry on the internal calendar confirmed it. An emergency stakeholder session convened quietly under the radar. No media, no full transparency, just 15 people with too much power and too little memory of where this company began. Elliot wasn't just watching anymore. He was planning his re-entry. Daryl found him near the vending machines, just off the executive corridor, pretending to check a leak in the ceiling tiles. No one else was around. He didn't waste time. "It is you," he said quietly. Elliot didn't look up. "You're mistaken," he replied, almost by instinct. But Daryl stepped closer. "The compression lattice in the Gen 2 prototype," he said. "You reinforced it with a dual-phase microcell. Everyone said it was impossible, but you found a way to stabilize it using temperature drift from the capacitor bleed. Elliot froze. The silence between them pulsed like a wire stretched too tight. Slowly he turned. Their eyes met. No more hiding. You should have spoken up, Daryl added, voice softer now. They're planning to hand everything over. Cameron's pitch got traction. Elliot nodded once. I know. Daryl hesitated, then asked the question that had been building since yesterday. So, what are you going to do? Elliot's reply was calm. Remind them who built this place. Inside the boardroom, the tension was wrapped in polite tones and polished blazers. Cameron stood at the head of the table, laser pointer in hand, presenting his pitch like a man certain of victory. The offer is real, he declared, voice confident. 50 million. Full acquisition. The buyer gets IP rights. We stay on as leadership, and they absorb our R&D into their existing structure. There were nods. A few raised brows. One executive asked about long-term autonomy, another about ethical licensing. Cameron dodged both with carefully rehearsed optimism. The tech survives. We get paid. Everybody wins. But what he didn't say, what no one in the room mentioned, was that the original licensing clause required the founder's consent for any full acquisition, and no one had seen Elliot Grant in years. Officially, he had disappeared. Unofficially, they assumed he didn't care anymore. That silence had been convenient. Until today, just as the vote was about to be called, the boardroom door clicked open. Heads turned. A few frowned, confused by the interruption. Elliot stepped inside slowly, still in his gray coveralls, gloves tucked in his belt, tablet cradled under one arm like it belonged there. Cameron's face shifted from annoyance to disbelief. This area's restricted, he said, rising from his chair. Security I won't be long. Elliot replied, his voice steady, eyes scanning the room. Then he walked to the end of the table, the seat reserved for the founder. The room rippled with discomfort. A few executives exchanged whispers. One murmured, "Is that?" Elliot placed the tablet down and turned it on. The screen displayed his name. Full, legal, signed under the original charter document. Elliot Grant, founder, chief systems architect, shareholder of record. Before any decisions are made, he said quietly, I think it's time someone told the truth. Silence gripped the room like a vice. Cameron stood frozen, hands clenched at his sides. One of the junior board members leaned forward, blinking at the name on the screen. This has to be a mistake, he muttered. But it wasn't. Elliot pulled up archived logs, IP filings, and internal memos bearing his signature, time-stamped and notarized. Every piece of the company's foundation, the patents, the protocols, even a board charter, led back to him. I built this company to solve problems, not sell illusions, Elliot said, his voice low but resolute. You've been cutting corners, repackaging my work, and now you're ready to sell it to people who wouldn't understand a single line of its code. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them. If you push this deal forward, I'll walk and take everything with me. No yelling, no theatrics, just the quiet authority of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The silence that followed Elliot's words wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. No one moved, no one spoke. Cameron slowly eased back into his chair, but his face had lost all color. Across the table, one of the partners, a woman named Russo, who had previously been silent through most of the pitch, cleared her throat. Mr. Grant, if I may, this is highly irregular. Elliot didn't blink. So, is rewriting calibration protocols to meet sales deadlines. And yet here we are. Someone let out a breath. Daryl, who had quietly slipped into the room moments before, stood at the back wall, arms crossed, saying nothing but making his presence known. Russo tried again, her tone shifting. We didn't know you were still involved. Elliot turned toward her, measured. You didn't want me to be. Cameron shifted in his seat. This doesn't have to be hostile, he said carefully. We've worked out a solution, one that includes you. Elliot raised an eyebrow. The trap was coming, and he knew it. Cameron leaned forward, folding his hands like a diplomat negotiating peace. Look, Elliot, we all know what this company meant to you. No one's questioning your legacy, but things have evolved. The structure is different now. The team's different. What we're building, it's global. He tapped a few lines on his tablet and slid it across the table. 50 million. Immediate transfer. Clean exit. No media. No drama. Your shares, your name, fully bought out. You walk with your head high. And we move forward without friction. The room tensed. It wasn't just a business offer. It was an erasure, gift-wrapped. A quiet exile in exchange for silence. Elliot stared at the screen, not even touching the tablet. You want me gone, he said flatly. Cameron gave a tight smile. We want the company to grow without baggage. For a moment, Elliot said nothing. Then, with a calm that cut deeper than any outburst, he answered, no, one word, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Elliot reached for his own tablet, older, scuffed, and covered with fingerprints. But what it contained made every device in the room look hollow. Over the last 9 months, he began, you've approved firmware updates that bypass critical diagnostics. Your newest rollout compromises safety protocols in favor of production speed. You even eliminated the fail-safe eye embedded for voltage surges, a function designed to prevent fires. He tapped the screen, pulling up timestamp commits, each one bearing Cameron's authorization ID. You didn't just repurpose my work. You diluted it, stripped it for parts, and sold it like a shiny upgrade. Russo opened her mouth, then closed it. A different executive muttered, Jesus. Elliot didn't raise his voice. You think I came back to fight for a paycheck? I came back because the thing I built to protect lives is being used to pad bonuses. You offer me 50 million to disappear. I'm offering you one final chance to course correct before it all crashes. Cameron's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, and the polished veneer he'd worn for the board began to splinter. You think you can waltz back in here after vanishing for a decade and lecture us on how to run this place? He snapped. You left. We built this version of Novitech. You had your garage and your theories. We turned it into a company. Elliot didn't flinch. Cameron kept going, his voice rising. You're not some savior. You're just a glorified tech head who got lucky. Without us, you'd still be fixing radios in some basement on the south side. The room stiffened. A few board members looked away. Others froze, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard what they just heard. Elliot tilted his head slightly. And there it is, he said softly. Not fear, not logic, just bias, dressed up in business suits. Daryl, from the back, finally stepped forward. That's enough, he said, the authority in his voice like a gavel. He built it. You exploited it. A heavy silence followed Daryl's words. This time it wasn't awkward, it was clarifying. Russo leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from corporate neutrality to reluctant respect. Another board member, Patel, a quiet man who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. I didn't know about the voltage failsafe, he said, eyes downcast. I assumed it was handled. Elliot looked at him. Assumption is what got us here. Cameron tried to recover, but the ground beneath him was crumbling. We can still move forward, he said quickly. This doesn't have to turn into a witch hunt. Elliot shook his head. No, it has to turn into accountability. He pulled up a document from his tablet, a restructuring proposal. Here's what happens next. We freeze the acquisition talks, reinstate the original safety protocols, and audit every engineering decision made in the last 12 months. Anyone who manipulated specs gets removed. No golden parachutes. No seed citademates. He looked around the room. We fix this, or we end it. Together. No one spoke for a full 30 seconds. It was the kind of pause that didn't ask for permission. It demanded alignment. Suavely, Husut nodded. Patel followed. One by one, the remaining board members lowered their eyes or gave small, almost imperceptible gestures of consent. Only Cameron remained rigid, his jaw tight, lips pressed together, staring not at Elliot, but at the document glowing on the screen. Elliot didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply reached out, closed his tablet, and pulled the chair at the head of the table toward him. It made a soft scrape against the polished floor, a sound more final than any gavel. Then he sat. Daryl took the seat beside him, sliding a fresh notepad forward. "Where do we start?" he asked. Elliot looked across the table at the company he had once built from scraps, now ready to be rebuilt with truth. "We start," he said, "by remembering what this was always meant to be, and who was never meant to serve." The fallout came swiftly. By the end of the week, Cameron's badge access was revoked, his desk emptied under quiet supervision. No press release, no goodbye party, just a one-sentence memo from legal confirming his departure. A few others followed, those who had signed off on critical compromises without so much as a second look. Elliot didn't linger on their exits. He let the accountability process run cleanly, without vendetta. What mattered more was rebuilding from the inside out. He met daily with department heads, often walking the floors instead of calling meetings. Engineers were surprised to see him crouched beside workbenches, sleeves rolled, asking questions no one had anticipated. Not to catch them, to understand them. Trust, once fractured, wasn't something that could be ordered. It had to be rebuilt, conversation by conversation, bite by bite. And slowly it was. The silence that once followed Elliot through the hallways had shifted. Now was nods, then greetings, then conversations. The ghost was becoming real again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline outside the glass-panel boardroom, Elliot sat across from Daryl on the break lounge, 2 mugs of coffee between them. No charts, no tablets, just silence and steam. "You know," Daryl said after a while, "when you left, we didn't just lose the inventor. We lost the compass." Elliot looked down at his cup, fingers tracing the rim. "I thought walking away would protect it, that I was the problem, that my presence would invite the wrong eyes." Daryl shook his head. "It wasn't your presence that hurt us. It was your silence." Elliot nodded slowly. "I'll let the noise take over. I thought by staying quiet, I was keeping peace. But all I did was make space for people who were louder. Not smarter, not wiser, just louder." Daryl leaned back. "And now?" Elliot met his gaze. "Now I speak, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then." At the next all-hands meeting, the auditorium buzzed with quiet curiosity. Most employees had only heard fragments. Whispers of a founder returning, a shake-up at the top, a boardroom that had gone silent mid-vote. When Elliot took the stage, there was no grand announcement, just a man in a simple navy shirt and worn jeans, stepping behind the mic like he belonged, because he did. "Some of you know me. Most of you don't," he began. "That's on me." He paused, letting the words settle. "I left this company thinking the product could speak for itself, that innovation would carry on without me. But I was wrong. Innovation without integrity is just noise, and noise is easy to sell." Faces in the crowd shifted. Some leaned forward. Others nodded. "I came back," he continued, "because I saw something brilliant slipping into something hollow, and I couldn't watch from the sidelines anymore." No one interrupted, because every word felt like something they'd been waiting to hear. Elliot took a breath, then continued. "This company was never built to chase valuation charts or acquisition headlines. It was built to solve real problems, with real consequences if we got them wrong." The room grew still. Somewhere along the line, we started thinking speed was more important than precision, that efficiency could replace ethics, that cutting corners could be called strategy. His voice didn't rise, but its weight deepened. "I'm not here to micromanage lines of code or dictate features. I'm here to remind us all, engineers, designers, managers, janitors, that what we build reflects who we are." A few people clapped, hesitant at first, then more joined. "And no matter how much money someone offers to buy what we've made, we don't sell the soul of it. We don't sell the part that makes it ours." That last line landed like a vow, and in that moment, the company didn't feel like a company. It felt like a mission again. When a meeting ended, Elliot didn't linger. He stepped down from the stage, quietly, weaving through side hallways to avoid the attention. But just outside the atrium, he found himself face to face with a group of engineers. Younger, sharper dressed, but with uncertainty still flickering in their eyes. Trevor was among them, the same Trevor who'd once mocked him in Lab B. He stepped forward awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir, I didn't know. We didn't know." Elliot didn't make him squirm. He just nodded. "I know." Another engineer, the young woman who'd questioned his access near the diagnostics room, spoke up. "That fix you mentioned, the one for micropulse drift, we ran it through this morning. It worked." Her tone was quieter now, almost reverent. Elliot smiled faintly. "Good. But next time, trust your own instincts, not just the loudest voice in the room." And with that, he walked past them, not above them, among them. That night, long after the lights dimmed and the floors had been swept clean, Elliot returned to the original engineering bay, the one tucked away behind two double doors no one used anymore. The walls were still scuffed, the vents still rattled near the ceiling, and in the corner, beneath a dusty tarp, sat the prototype he'd built a lifetime ago with a salvage fan motor and a soldering gun that sparked more than it sealed. He didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long while. Then he sat on the stool beside it, opened his notebook, not a tablet, just paper, and began sketching again, not to fix what had broken, not to reclaim what had been stolen, but to start over, on his own terms, with new eyes. As the night deepened outside, the hum of machines around him felt less like noise and more like music, the kind you only hear when you finally know you're home.